Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second webinar on the Oxford tutorial from the Centre for Tutorial Teaching, or CTT. CTT deconstructs and demystifies the methods of teaching that operate at institutions such as Oxford, Cambridge, and elsewhere, and we disseminate those methods for everyone to use. We do this through training, coaching, consultancy, and research for schools, universities, companies, and corporations across the globe. If you'd like to learn more about us, our contact information will be displayed at the end of the webinar. I'm delighted to welcome you to our second installment of CTT's public webinar series. As you may be aware, this series aims to showcase different general insights into tutorial learning. The webinars will present big questions about education and the workplace today, and how the tutorial method sits within those big picture contexts. The webinar which you're about to watch focuses on higher education, vocational education and training, and the tutorial method. It is delivered by Professor Ken Mayhew. Ken Mayhew is Emeritus Professor of Education and Economic Performance at the University of Oxford, Emeritus Fellow in Economics at Pembroke College, which is one of the constituent colleges of the University of Oxford, and Extraordinary Professor of Education and Economic Performance at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. Professor Mayhew is an economist and has published widely on labor economics, human resource management, the economics of education and training, and policy analysis. He was Economic Director of the UK's former National Economic Development Office and is a current member of the Armed Forces Pay Review Body.
What I want to talk about today is developments on the education and training scene in the years after compulsory schooling. My own view is that things have gone badly wrong with the system, that there are problems across the developed world, and they're particularly severe in the UK, about which I'll have a lot to say, being based here in Britain. But much of what I'm going to describe, to varying degrees, will be an issue in other countries, and indeed in parts of the developing world as well. I'll describe what I think has gone wrong, what I think might be done about it, and in doing the latter, talk about how the tutorial approach and the tutorial system might help in making things a bit better. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes. And the first one, the problem for tertiary education up there, relates to the whole of the system, if you like, from degree level education at universities right the way through to low-level short course qualifications, vocational qualifications. The author of this quote, Andreas Schleicher, has run this bit of the OECD, the Education and Skills Directorate, for quite a number of years now. He was at one time a great optimist, a great believer that educational improvements would almost automatically lead to better economic fortunes for the individuals involved and a healthier and more productive economy. As you'll see from that quote, he's become a little bit less optimistic. So let's try and parse that quote a little bit. Tertiary education has seen unprecedented growth in the past decade. I'll say more about that in a minute. There's a significant share of graduates, and I think what he means here are university graduates, people with bachelor's degrees, who can't find good jobs. And at the same time, employers say they can't find people with the skills they need. So you've got this extraordinary counterpoint there, that graduates not being able to find decent jobs, and at the same time, employers say, just can't find the guys with the skills. And that's what I'll be exploring in the next hour or so. He goes on, the tertiary education sector needs to reinvent itself to give people greater ownership over what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, and where they learn, to meet tomorrow's demand for knowledge and skills. Can we go to the next slide, please, Rose? The second quote refers specifically to higher education, to universities, if you like. And this is from a guy called Chris Brink. He is a South African mathematician who until recently had a stint as Vice Chancellor, that's, if you like, head of Newcastle University in the northeast of England. And I think this is a particularly revealing quote from someone who just finished running one of our big higher educational institutions. He says there are these two key questions that we should ask. What are we good at? And what are we good for? And what he's saying here is that, in his view, people like him who've been running our universities, and this is a British comment, but I know holds true of universities in so many other countries, that people like him spent most of the time, if not all the time, worrying about what they were good at, but not worrying about what they were good for. And what does he mean by that? Well, what he was saying, I think, was that he was part of a university system, I'll talk about the UK, but again, it's true, I think, for other countries, where you basically had a form of internally regarded competition amongst universities. The context in the UK would be this, that whilst most of our universities are private charities, they are dependent on the government for their funding, both teaching and research. In Britain, it's the students who essentially pay the fees now, but they can pay the fees because they're eligible for loans from a government-backed student loan company. And the government can, at least in theory, withdraw the ability of students to draw down loans if they disapprove of a particular higher educational establishment. And when it comes to research funding, this comes in two lumps. Some of it is competition for grants and projects from our various research councils. And some of it comes in a lump sum to the universities. And how much they get depends on how well regarded the research of that university is. And periodically, every 5 years or so, the government conduct this absurd exercise where every department in every university is marked by a panel of so-called national experts who are usually incredibly corrupt in my view, but that's a different matter. And depending on how well the universities do in this appalling competition, that will determine the amount of funding that they get in that lump sum. So universities are concerned to impress the authorities to get the money. And there's also, of course, this, as it were, inside the game competition. We want to be a better university than any other university. And this is part just pride. It's also in part an attempt to attract the best students and the best staff. The way, and if you go onto the adverts in Times Higher Education, our specialist weekly journal here in the UK, you'll see countless universities claiming that they're world number 1 or no, world number 3 in this or that and the other. It's become an almost absurd exercise. The way it's worked in the UK is that this has led to a massively increased emphasis in most universities on research as opposed to teaching. The balance has swung very much towards research. And this is partly, I think, the pressures of international reputation, but it's also partly the way that funding has worked. Although, and I know there are two people in the audience very much concerned with this, although the government is concerned to improve teaching quality, thus far, money has not been directly attached to that as it has been to research quality. And indeed, hard as it is to assess research quality, it's even harder to assess teaching quality. So pursuing the money and international repute, universities have massively increased the stress on research. This is rather odd if you think about it. In my own subject, economics, if I ask the question, how many times is the average economics article, or the median economics article to be precise, cited by anyone except its own author? What's the answer to the nearest integer? The answer is 0. So you do have to wonder about the social value of much of the research which is being done. In my view, I'll say more about this in a minute, at the expense of teaching. But what did Brink mean with this second point? What are we good for? I think what he was saying here is that anyone running any institution has to have a very clear view of what its mission is. And what Brink was saying is that those running our universities haven't really thought very carefully about that, as opposed to this competitive bidding to answer the first question. And this is particularly extraordinary at a time when in most, if not all countries, the university sector has expanded massively apart from the States, which has been a big sector for years. In other countries, a relatively recent phenomenon. And you might think, as other countries had moved to mass higher education, this would lead people to think more carefully about, does that mean the mission of a university today is the same as it was 40 years ago? And I think what Brink was saying is there's not a lot of evidence of that. So next slide, please, Rose. So let's talk about higher education first before I get on to vocational education. As we've seen already, a massive expansion of participation in higher education across OECD countries and of course across countries, many countries in the rest of the world. As an illustration, in the mid-1960s in Britain, only about 6% of young people went on to university. There was a relatively sustained expansion, but even as recently as 1989, it was only 19%. Today, it's close to 50%. The problem in the UK is that the structure of jobs available has not changed as rapidly as the number of people being churned out of our universities. So the consequence of that is that more and more graduates have been going into jobs which, at least by occupational description, were once done, as it were, by their non-graduate mothers and fathers. The consequences of that I'll come to in a moment. The extent of this expansion and the timing varies from country to country, but most importantly, it's happened in very, very different institutional settings. And a useful comparison here is between the UK and the US on the one hand, and the Germanic countries, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and the Netherlands on the other. The difference between the UK and those 4 countries is that those 4 countries have got well-established, vibrant alternative pathways from compulsory schooling into the world of work. In Switzerland, as a consequence, students leaving the upper secondary level, only 30% of them actually follow an academic course at the tertiary level. The rest follow vocational courses. In Austria, a rather different institutional setup, but again, a vibrant pathway, alternative pathway, 75% of young people there choose vocational routes rather than academic routes. The Dutch, a different system yet again, has 3 different streams from as young as the age of 12, 1 academic, 1 vocational, and 1 essentially for students who need special attention, who are not doing well academically, with various rescue points for them. And those routes go right the way through secondary, upper secondary, into tertiary education. And if there are unfortunate consequences of in labour market terms, of the expansion of higher education, they're more likely to be mediated in those countries which have these alternative pathways, which are giving a genuine choice to people, than they would be in a country like the UK. Next slide, please, Rose. So we've got graduates entering non-graduate jobs. Now, if we go back to, say, the 1980s in Britain, and this lack of alternative pathways, if you didn't go on through school, then the school leaving age was 16, but you could go on to 18 to get a higher level qualification at school. If you then didn't go on into higher education, the vast majority of people are going straight into the world of work. And we had a very inadequate training set up for them. There was an apprenticeship system, but it was described as narrow and elitist. By narrow was meant it taught people a very narrow range of skills rather than modular learning across a whole variety of skills. Elitist because it was a system available for relatively few people. So people had relatively little choice. And the consequence of that is what I've called on this chart here, occupational filtering down. Kids are going to university just to get the job their mum got with what was A-levels, the school leaving qualification, a generation ago. And the content of that job in most cases is no different from when mum did exactly the same job. Now, it's a strange system because someone like me might go on about what a waste, that people could qualify those jobs with far less education at far less expense. But as a parent, you'd still want your kid to go to university. And the reason for that would be you'd be aware that if they didn't go to university, they wouldn't be able to get even these not very good jobs because they wouldn't have the credential, that is a university degree, which would encourage employers to look at them. So the oddity of that is if something goes wrong with the system, then perfectly rational and reasonable agents, people in that system, react to play the system. And in a sense, they confirm the system. And that's, I think, the real danger of this. And you need the degree to get the job, but you don't need a degree to do the job. That's assuming that the university has actually taught you anything useful, but let's assume that for the moment. And that's an expensive, wasted investment. In the UK and in the US, of course, it's individuals who generally are bearing the expense. In continental European countries, it's much more, the expense is much more often borne largely by the state. But society is, in this narrow economic sense, wasting an investment. And if you don't have vibrant alternative pathways, like the UK, then what's happening? Young people who might a generation and a half ago have gone to try to train in a trade and obtain a lower level qualification than a bachelor's, now find themselves going to the University of the Black Country to do a bachelor's degree in Beckham studies rather than doing a plumbing apprenticeship or becoming an electrician or whatever they might have otherwise done. And that's why we got what Schleiter noted in that first quote, the coexistence of skill shortages with the underutilization of skill for many graduates. So on to the next chart, please, Rose. Now, I've put this up as an illustration because it essentially shows how complacent many governments were about this. Still are, but less so. I think that they're getting more in touch with reality. But this comes from the European Commission, or more accurately from an agency called CEDIFOP within the Commission, which is their agency responsible for vocational training. And this is trying to address some of the issues that I've been talking about, and is split between the percentage of workforce in all of those countries who are overqualified for their job, underqualified, and where they're matched. And it doesn't look a total disaster. The top purplish bar for each country is where people are matched. The black is where they're overqualified, and the yellow is where they're underqualified. Now, it's not a pretty picture. So, for example, if you look at the fifth country along from the left, i.e. that's Ireland, only 50% of their workforce is matched. The country at the extreme right, FI, is Finland. They have rather better matching. But governments were misleading themselves when they did this, because look carefully at the note there, where a matched worker is one who has the modal qualification in their occupational group. Now, if you think about that, it's government-inspired nonsense. Let me give you an example. It's my favorite example. Let's go back 40 years to London. And let's assume there are 100 people working in coffee shops, 100 baristas. And 90 of them were people with some school leaving qualification. And 10 of them were graduates of Imperial College London who'd fallen onto hard times temporarily through overuse of drugs or what have you. And so on this measure, those 10 graduates would be overqualified. The modal qualification was the school leaving qualification. Today, when you look to 100 coffee shop workers in London, they'd all be graduates. And not a single one of them, this qualification would be described as overqualified. On this measure, they'd be matched. And so governments became rather complacent about this as you experienced this occupational filtering down. And if we look at the next chart from roughly the same period, we get a slightly different impression. Whereas the previous chart was what qualification do you need to get the job, this is about what qualification you need to do the job. And what you can see there is a really quite worrying picture of university graduate underutilisation. Now, I use these dates to match with the earlier chart, but the picture wouldn't look massively different today. We've got the 2 years there. And you'll see that the picture varies from country to country, but it's a common problem across countries. The UK, right at the end of that chart, it will not appear in future such charts, having left the European Union, sadly. 40% effectively of graduates were underutilised. They didn't need what they'd learnt at university to do the job. If you spend a bit of time looking at the chart later, I'm assuming Rose will send these charts around to those interested, you'll find that the underutilisation is rather less in those Germanic-speaking countries I was talking about. It appears that the alternative pathways do help a bit to mediate this problem. Okay, on to the next chart then. And now I want to turn to the vocational route. As I said, it was historically inadequate in the UK. I described a situation in the 1980s. Arguably, the expansion of higher education has actually made the vocational route even poorer historically in the UK. And there are many reasons for that. One reason is that governments obsessed by people getting higher and higher qualifications, as though that in itself is wonderful, that the degree must be better than some sub-degree qualification, has effectively put more resource into higher education than our further education sector. So what limited capability we had on the vocational route has to an extent been damaged by the expansion of higher education itself. And other countries have not been free from this threat. Germany is a particularly interesting example here. Everybody knows about the German, or thinks they know, about the German dual system, where school leavers essentially take an apprenticeship and spend part of their time in the company and part of the time in a college learning off-site skills and more general skills. And I'll come to that later. What's interesting, though, at the moment is that, and it's been true for a while, is the supply of such dual places, apprenticeship places, is exceeding demand. There are more places than young Germans who want to take up that option at the moment. And there are a number of reasons for that, but part of it, again, is the lure of higher education. And the way the Germans who seem to be starting to respond to that is they're reinventing this dual system. They're moving it from essentially school 16 or 17 to 18 or 19. And so the dual system is now more likely to involve degree level apprenticeships rather than some lower level apprenticeships. However, if we believe that these alternative pathways, however threatened, are have managed to at least diminish the nature of the problem caused by the expansion of higher education in labour market terms, what does that imply for countries like the UK, which don't have such pathways, and I would argue also the US? Well, I think the point there, it's a critical point, is you can't just invent new institutions overnight, or you can, but it's not an easy route and they're likely to fail. Her Majesty's government in this country has tried to invent countless training institutions over the last 50 years, all with different names, all with the same aim, and all with ultimate failure. And they're going through another round of this at the moment. The only route, if you believe there's anything in my argument here, the only way to change this is to actually change what the present system offers, and not to be frightened to reduce the weight of bachelors and above and increase the weight of lower level vocational qualifications. And what would this involve? It would involve putting more resource into FE colleges and actually finding the people to teach these vocational qualifications. And it would involve, I'll use the word persuading, but it's probably the wrong word, persuading at least a proportion of our so-called higher education institutions to change their offer, to offer more subdegree, shorter course qualifications and less full degree academic qualifications. And I think there are levers that could be used to do that. And without that, I think we're in danger of continuing to have this mixed problem of university graduates not being able to get the jobs they think they deserve, and skill shortages in other occupations. In other words, I'm going back to the Chris Brink quote and saying what we urgently need in a country like Britain and any other country which doesn't have alternative pathways is for those running higher education to actually spend a lot more time thinking about how they need to change their mission. And it might be interesting here to go into a tiny bit more detail. If we go to the next chart, please, Rose. And what I'm going to do here is to contrast two approaches to higher education. This chart here is from the Robbins report, which was a long time ago, 1963. And the Robbins report, Robbins was head of LSE, was a government commissioned report to actually make recommendations about the expansion of HE. And indeed, it was largely as a consequence of HE that many British universities, that many British universities who now take for granted, like East Anglia, Essex, Warwick, emerged. They were born out of this report. And right at the beginning of the report, Robbins says, what should higher education be doing? And there's this quote at the bottom: there are 4 objectives essential to any properly balanced system. Objective 1 there is beautiful, almost medieval language. Instruction in skills suitable to play a part in the general division of labour. What he means there is actually skills that are useful in the labour market. What was interesting is if you read the report in detail, he introduces this almost apologetically. We know it's vulgar for universities to think about these things, but you know, we do have to start thinking about them. They have to make a contribution to the economy. 2 is absolutely critical when we start to get to the tutorial method a little later. What is taught should be taught in such a way as to promote the general powers of the mind. That is incredibly important. I think what he was getting at here was that in many ways, the distinction between vocational and academic can be false. You can teach very practical subjects in very different ways. And in teaching them in certain ways, people can be made to think and to develop their critical thinking skills. And Robbins thought that that was absolutely essential for anything calling itself a university. 3, the advancement of learning. He refused to use the word research. He said research was part of the advancement of learning. People should keep up to date, those teaching, etc. And he stressed that research should never outweigh teaching and these other aims. And then finally, something he was very uncomfortable with, transmission of a common culture and common standards of citizenship. Now, if we move to the next slide, we can contrast that with the much less well-written statements of more modern civil servants. This is from a 2016 white paper. I could have chosen a whole variety of similar ones. And the message that comes out of this is, in the government's mind, higher education has become much more instrumental. All the right words are used. If you look at the centre there, our universities are powerhouses of intellectual and social capital. They create the knowledge, capability, and expertise that drive competitiveness. Instrumental, all about the economic return to the country. And then they'll give this nod and nurture the values that sustain our open democracy. You then look to the left and the right, and it's all about what it's delivering to the labour market and getting value for money. The skills that HE provides will be increasingly in demand as the number of high school jobs rises. It's meeting demand. There could be a whole talk on the fatuousness of believing that the number of high school jobs will rise, but that's for another day. So the point to get across is that HEs, and this is true of other countries as well. I see exactly the same in the Netherlands, where I spent part of my time, or at least did before COVID. The system's become far more instrumental, far more narrow, and yet far more directed to the labour market. Yet it's failing to deliver to the labour market. Next slide, please, Rose. So what's been going on there? Well, here there's a bitter debate, and there are many commentators who believe that part of the story here of just thinking about the labour market and getting the students out and trying to get them decent jobs is that teaching has dumbed down in universities. It is very difficult to establish this with any great certainty. My own view, though, is that it has, and I'll explain why I think that in a second. One reason that people give is something I referred to earlier, that if staff are more concerned with their research than teaching, they're not going to put as much emphasis on their teaching and the quality of that. One thing we do know is there's grade inflation. So a massively bigger percentage of students today, and this also is true of other countries, a massively bigger percentage of students today are getting high grades that they wouldn't have got in the past. Now, that creates the difficult distinction between the content and assessment of courses. It may well be that the assessment of courses has become less demanding, so there is grade inflation. But that doesn't mean that the content is less. I think I would argue here that if you have generous assessment methods, in the end, that will affect the content of courses as experienced by most students. And I'm relying to some extent here on personal experience. I better not mention the universities, but like most academics of my generation, I spent a lot of time as external examining at other universities. And there's one bachelor's experience I can recall. And what you found there was the individuals preparing the course had very good course content. But the assessment methods were such that an ambitious student, and they tended to be a very small minority, would get a hell of a lot out of the course and could cover the whole range, and the course wasn't dumbed down. But the more instrumentally minded student, the less academically ambitious student, could pick out certain segments of that course and essentially learn and churn, repeat it in an exam without developing anything other than the ability to remember a few things, and get a perfectly reasonable degree. And my experience in examining master's courses is similar. And a final example which worries me is right at the PhD level. A PhD is meant to be a PhD is meant to be a PhD. I was examining a PhD in another country. Again, I better not name the country. And the setup there was they had 3 local examiners and 2 foreign examiners, of whom I was one. And as it happens, the other foreign examiner was an ex-PhD student of mine who now works in France. And she rang me up. We'd both just finished doing a thesis. We can't pass this. This wouldn't get through a transfer at the end of the first year in Oxford. And it was true. But the point we had to consider is, should you go for vertical or horizontal justice here, as it were? If we had some absolute standard, that thesis would have got nowhere near a PhD. But it would also have been very unfair to the individual we were examining, because we knew that 10 other theses by different individuals in that foreign university were going to get PhDs. So there are real problems with standards, and in my view, it has to an extent dumbed down content. And I could give you examples of that even in Oxford. And I sometimes think that what we've seen in a number of universities is what I call there a non-aggression pact between the students and the staff. You don't bother us and we won't bother you too much. And one of the scary things here is that question, how hard the students work. And the answer to that question varies by subject and by country. But the continental European students, according to the surveys, tend to work more hours a week than British students or American students. But the variance within a country like Britain would suggest that some students are spending no more than 11 or 12 hours a week during term on academic and class contact and private academic work combined. So what do we mean by a full-time student? It's suggesting to me that quite a lot of so-called 3 or 4 year bachelor's courses could in fact be done in 2 years. So I think there are real problems about the dumbing down of the system and the failure to deliver in the labour market. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But let's look at the next chart, please, Rose. Let's look at sub-degree vocational training. And what I'm suggesting so far is we need to improve, to change the balance of the system between degree and sub-degree. And we need to get the academic bit of the higher education system to perform more effectively. Now, what about sub-degree vocational training if we're going to change the balance? What do we know about this? Well, we know that good vocational training doesn't just tell you how to do something, it tells you why you're doing it. It gives you a knowledge of context. And it trains you narrowly in a particular trade, be it electrics or plumbing or whatever, rather than narrow. And there's a very interesting example from some of my colleagues in Maastricht here, Dutch example. In the Dutch vocational schools, we're looking at the 16 to 18-year-olds here. You'll find in one particular type of school, there are two types within this general type. One is a vocational school which is essentially funded by one particular employer. And the other type is a school which is funded by the government. And in any given trade, plumbing, electrics, or whatever, what you find is that in the schools funded by the employer, the training is very specific to what that employer needs. I need people who can do X or Y or Z. In the schools funded by the government, because they don't have an employer immediately on their backs, within the same trade, they're doing much wider training or much more contextual training. The subsequent labour market fortunes of the graduates from these vocational schools are fascinating. For the first 3 years after leaving school, the kids who went to the firm-dominated schools do better in the labour market, unsurprisingly. Thereafter, it's the kids who went to the government schools and had the wider education who do better in the labour market, because they're more flexible, they can change employers more easily, etc., etc. And of course, a good vocational course needs to teach core skills in addition to trade skills, literacy and numeracy. And perhaps most important of all, it needs to teach people how to learn. Next slide, please, Rose. Now, if we're going to bolster the vocational route in the UK, then we need to make sure we're doing it that it's so that it's delivering well. And there'll be some interesting pieces of work on what German companies operating in the UK think of our vocational training. Managing director of A&T, a nice young guy, but didn't have the basic skills, no basic literacy or numeracy. Personal director of E.ON. Work readiness seems to be lacking amongst British youngsters. And on to the next chart, which is even more revealing. This comes from a large survey of British apprentices from German companies operating in the UK. We are teaching more than skills. In the future, there will be robots to turn the screws, one educator told us. We don't need workers for that. What we need are people who can solve problems, skilled, thoughtful, self-reliant employees who understand the company's goals and methods and can improvise when things go wrong or when they see an opportunity to make something work better. That's describing a good apprenticeship, and it's wide, and it's not just about learn and churn, and it's not just about teaching someone how to do something incredibly specific. And as the authorities in Britain try to improve their apprenticeships, they need to bear that in mind. And it's not clear as they're inventing their T-levels that they're doing this very well at the moment. So where does the tutorial method fit into all of this? Well, what I'm suggesting, if you buy my argument that there are these problems, is the solution involves many changes, but the tutorial method can make a contribution, and not just at the university level. I think the important thing to bear in mind here is that we have to distinguish between the content and aim of a tutorial on the one hand and the delivery mechanism. And because we're Oxford and the term tutorial is very much associated with Oxford and Cambridge, we think of some Don holding his sherry glass in a book-lined room in an ancient college in a gown with two students having an intense discussion about Kierkegaard or what have you. Well, those one-to-one or one-to-two tutorials are there and play a role. But it's what you try to do in the tutorial, not how you deliver it, which is important. And it's all about developing those critical thinking skills that I was talking about, the essence of a good apprenticeship. And this can be delivered in classrooms. It doesn't have to be two people. It can be delivered in work-based training. I have a colleague in Wales who's tried to insert these ideas into some training for NHS paramedics. Nothing like the Oxford tutorial. And of course, it can be inserted into the design of the job itself. The place you actually learn most is doing your job, as if the job is well designed, not formal training episode. So going on to the next slide, what does the essence of this training involve? And I've put up the things there, and it's pretty obvious. First of all, identifying the problem or the issue, not just waiting for someone else to tell you what the problem is. Once you've identified the problem, assembling and interrogating the relevant evidence, then providing an answer or a solution. And I've put assessing confidence intervals. What I mean by that is making some assessment of how firm that solution is. It may not be perfect. Conveying the answer to people. And most importantly of all, seeing links and connections that others don't see. It's all about resourcefulness. And what arguably a good German apprenticeship has done more than the conventional British apprenticeship, has done that better than we have. And so the people who want to change the system need to bear that very clearly in mind. And the other important thing to come out of all of this is that when people talk about tutorials, again, we're the prisoners of our historical images. And we think about all of this as being associated with, the intellectual elite, the really intelligent people who go to good universities. The point of all of this is it's not just for the intellectual elite. It's for everybody, irrespective of abilities. These critical thinking skills can be developed at all levels of educational attainment. And I think that's been one of the historic snobberies of Britain, that, this belief that there are only a few people who can do this and the rest are operational peasants, because they didn't go to good universities and so on. And that we still need to get over. And then finally, what's the payoff for all of this? Well, it's pretty obvious. For the individual, they're more attractive to potential employers. They have a bigger choice of employers. Once they're with an employer, if they've developed these broader critical thinking skills and resourcefulness, they're more attractive candidates for promotion and progression within that company. But also, it's easier for them to move to other employers. And as we experience massive industrial and compositional change in what we produce, the end of a job for life and all of that, this ability to move between employers as your present employer runs down, goes out of business, needs less labor somewhere else, and to show other employers that your skills are transferable and that you can learn quickly and that you can learn easily is incredibly important. And that's, again, all about the ability to learn. And by implication, much of, if not most of what I've been talking about so far is about young people. But when we think about education and training, adults are really quite important. They're the majority of the workforce. And people well into the workforce face major challenges and will continue to face major challenges as the economy changes ever more rapidly. And we need to equip them to face those challenges. And having this critical thinking resourcefulness built in both to higher education courses and to lower level courses is vital for giving adults the best chance possible to survive in a harsh and rapidly changing world. And the benefits for the economy are obvious. And if you have critical thinking skills, hopefully that will lead to a more sensible democracy, which we certainly need in this country. Though when we look at the thinking skills of some of our major cabinet ministers at the moment, there is some qualification to my argument there. And I would guess that we certainly need it in the States, and perhaps it would help with that. And at that point, Rose, I will end my rant about the present system.
Thank you so much for that, Ken. We've got just over 5 minutes for some questions. If anybody wants to mute themselves and ask a question directly, feel free. Otherwise, free to put them in the chat. I've got one to start us off whilst people get their questioning cogs turning. Ken, you mentioned that in Germany, they're already doing quite a good job at bolstering their vocational offer by building in critical thinking skills and competencies into their training models. Can you give a sense of what that looks like? I wonder if you have any insights to how that practically looks.
Yeah, I was thinking of trying to do a slide on this, but it was so complex and mainly in German, which I don't understand, so I didn't do it. But if anyone wanted to investigate it, you could take particular occupations and take, for example, HGV drivers, truck drivers. What do you need to learn to become a truck driver? And if you looked at the broad overall stages of what you have to qualify it, the German and British systems look very similar because they're following an EU template for what you need to be a registered truck driver. But then if you look into detail in each component, to give you one example, what happens if the engine suddenly stops working? The British truck driver is taught to do two things in essence. One is, depending on the truck, to plug in one of those computer diagnostic devices and then a number to ring at the same time, or if they haven't got the diagnostic device, just the number. In Germany, they're encouraged to think about what's going on in the engine, why it's happened. There are also, if you look at the HGV, you'll find there are more general courses in writing skills and reading skills and things like that. And that will be typical if you compared across a whole series of occupations. I think Chris Millward has a question. I see his hand up.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks for a fabulous session, really insightful. I was just going to make an observation about what happened in England. I mean, I think in England, the intention initially with increasing participation was that it would not be all young full degree, there would be more sub-degree. But then when the cost was shifted more to the students, student choice became the driver, and students and universities both made that focus on full degree. I think I strongly support the notion we need to rebalance, but I had two questions about how to do it. So one was, you said you had some thoughts about how to rebalance back towards sub-degree qualifications. Is that about rationing the kind of voucher to the individual, or rebalancing the contributions from the individual of the state, so you get the kind of state-shaped investment you talked about in the Netherlands? And then the second question for me is an equity one. How do you avoid still the most prosperous people from the most prosperous places doing the full degree route, and others doing the other ones, and that flowing through to what happens to them after higher education?
Yeah, I think inequality of access, if we use that broad term, is a real problem. And I've said little which would resolve the still a major issue. And in fact, I think what you're hinting at, my suggestions would almost make it worse. However, I think I feel it's very hard when institutions are essentially private institutions, that governments have to work through incentives, as it were, rather than mandates. It's easier to rebalance a system in government-owned systems, as in many continental European countries. But I think it would probably require, what we have seen is the reluctance of some of our universities, not just the ex-polys, but some of our less prestigious pre-92 universities, their reluctance to change their product. They seem to be dominated by some false notion of esteem, etc., etc. Somehow or other, they've got to be forced to do that. I could see a system where financial incentives would do it, where you'd basically be saying, over a period of time, you're not getting the current block of money unless you do X or Y or Z. I know that the office with which you're involved is thinking about this already, but it isn't easy. I think we've got an incredibly uncooperative set of vice chancellors, many of whom would find it difficult to get a job running a London bus company. And therefore, I think it's going to have to be quite a rough and tumble game, but I think it is possible. I mean, the one encouraging thing is that's all from the supply side. We are seeing some increasing signs that if offered the opportunity, young people will see the merits of doing a sub-degree apprenticeship, possibly subsequently leading to a degree apprenticeship. And the one thing that will influence recalcitrant vice chancellors is demand in this respect. So I would actually be working quite hard on the demand side, which I think is in part a matter of public education. And it doesn't solve your problem of access, but I think there are probably quite a lot of reasonably well-heeled families who've started to realize with one generation of their children that going to a not very good university, getting a not very good degree, hasn't been brilliant in the labour market. So I think we can work on the demand side as well.
Thanks.
Fantastic. I've just looked at the time. We are bang on an hour. And I just wanted to make a note of Timothy's contribution to the chat. He was talking about the who you know concept and how that can impact choice. Yeah. And I think that kind of overlapped with what Chris was just talking about in terms of equity and access and how that can inform young people's choices post-school. So perhaps in a future iteration of our webinar, we can really unpack the equity question and think about how the tutorial can really expand opportunities for young people depending on whatever choice they want to make. So thank you so much for your time today. If you have any questions, any themes that you want to hear spoken about in future webinars, please feel free to contact us. We have a website. We also have an email address, info@ctt-education.com. There is our address. If any of you are thinking of flying over from the Atlantic and visiting the UK, we are there in Oxford. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope to see you all again. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.